that's most interesting, because when I was living with my grandparents, like as a kid growing up, I grew up in a family where it's like my dad made it out the hood, but it wasn't really the hood, it was poverty. You know what I'm saying? And so my dad makes it out, and I grow up middle class in the big city, right? And I really grow up in a bubble where it's like most of my time, I'm just spending my time with myself in my own world, reading my books, playing outside in my yard, just in my bubble, you know? And I would hate getting pulled out of my bubble over some bullshit. And I always saw like family gatherings as some bullshit. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm like 8 years old, 9 years old. Oh, we have to travel 6, 7, 8 hours. You know what I'm saying? To go see these people where there's not even like tar roads. You know what I'm saying? And you're just like, what the fuck? Like you're just pulled out of your bubble of electricity and modernity and all of this shit. And so like usually it's a once, you know, it's like a special occasion trip. Oh, let's go visit the family, it's Easter. Let's go visit the family, it's Christmas, it's New Year, that kind of thing. But it also happens when someone dies and it's time for a funeral, right?
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because I grew up Catholic, and so it's very interesting when in your household your family certainly values church and Christianity, but when it comes to giving these rites of the dead, they employ very pagan or paganisque rituals, you know what I'm saying, to honor and venerate their dead. And it's like one of those, like, it's almost surreal because you're like, but these people are Christian. And when you grow up in a like Catholic school, Catholic churches, etc., it's like you cannot worship false idols. Like you learn these things so closely, you know, growing up this way, being taught about the Bible, you learn these things so closely, and inevitably things that you see and experience in your life, you will leverage against what you've learned in church, you know? So I think it's very interesting putting it that way.
I think you've touched on something which is very important, which actually answers Awonga's question in much more sort of historical terms. And the key issue to sort of take note of here is that a lot of the time we look at these political issues and we look at a lot of these things and not like put it into context of what happens with religious institutions. And we look at witchcraft as if it's just an act on its own, as if those also don't have their religious institutions.
Yeah.
You have to understand the work of the missionaries and the context under which it came into Africa, right? At first, there was missionaries exploring the Dark Continent. Then at some point in time, missionaries were coming to explore in order to exploit resource and also to colonize and etc. etc. So the difference between the first missionaries who came long time ago, the ones who had all the information to give to the ones who would eventually come to colonize, came in order to learn about otherworldly experiences. And it's very interesting that you speak about the Catholic institution because it's also one of the first. And the Catholic institution has had a very interesting approach to acknowledging the cultures of other people as they do their missionary work of recruiting them. So you'll find that in the Catholic Church, they value that spirit of argument to a certain extent and allow certain things. It's like a semi-compromise, like accept the power and you'll get some small things that you can continue to do. That's why there's different styles of Catholic churches all over Africa. I think that in Southern Africa, they're much firmer in terms of their hold and belief system. But there's a lot of other places where Catholic churches practice quite a lot of rituals, which people are like, what's going on here, you know? And I think that this is a spectrum which is not acknowledged because, you know, if you've done politics, people will tell you that how should states be governed, as secular or by the church? And it comes from that whole thing of what is your constitution? Is our constitution the Bible or is our constitution made by man? You know, so So a lot of the time we don't look at it in that big systems approach. That when the Catholicism comes and all the other Christian faiths, they had what was called the civilizing mission ideology. They predicated a lot of things that were coming to civilize these people, but really what it meant was that we're coming to make them assimilate to our culture. So, which means already the first institution that colonialism had to break down was the religious system,
Yeah.
which really puts you at your base that you can't have any entity without some sort of faith that drives people, some faith in some higher power that guides people into a certain code of discipline. And so they would have never been able to enter Africa if they didn't attack all those components. And so which really means that when they come in there and they're trying to get people to follow their movement, what do they have to do to the existing traditions? They have to look for the weak spots, the things that people hate about having to subscribe to whatever religion it is. Then they have to demonize it. The very word witchcraft is such a thing, because people were being persecuted for witchcraft throughout the continent. And what usually was the measurement? In Uganda or other places, they would burn witches. In West Africa, witches could get sold into slavery, And so there's all these stories about where did all these African religions and traditions go, and now they're underground. So when you ask, is witchcraft practiced in some of these circles? It's a very complicated story, and it really depends who's on top of what institution and what is it exactly that they subscribe to. Because you can walk into an institution that's primarily Christian, that's fine. Primarily Muslim, that's fine. Primarily Jewish, that's fine. Like the Ethiopian state is Orthodox Christianity and so on and so forth. But then you have these other places where the missionaries had a really, really hard time getting through, and they made a lot more compromises. And then you see them being allowed to do some of these other rituals on the side. It's also one of the reasons why a lot of people believe that the Vatican probably holds the most cultural artifacts of many world cultures. The Catholic Church definitely knows a lot more about other religions than anybody else. So as to what exists in the Vatican, it's an untold story. The Catholic Church has these books that they don't allow many people to read, all there. So, which tells you that, at some point it was a religious war, and then we've just forgotten that because we've convinced ourselves that it's secularism. But in Africa, people are guided by their spirituality. So if they say they're Christian and they really believe it, then if they attain positions of power, then they guide their selections according to who can be a part of that. So yes, I believe that the people in those institutions or those organizations can do such things if they feel that this is what it will take to hold people accountable to me as a leader.
So it's like you have the imperialism wanting to conquer, and you have the means of conquering, the spiritual conquer. Take down everyone's spirit, right? Then you can have everything else that a person has. Or let's say you can get access to everything. So you would say the African, not issue, but the African dilemma is more of a spiritual one. Than it is of a I would say physical, or how would you say that? Just like a circular one, as you said.
Yeah. I mean, let's take an example which is closer to home. I mean, coincidentally, he's gotten arrested today, but if you look at his tactics, they override secular logic. Jacob Zuma seemed to be like somebody who just doesn't really care. But no, that's not.
Well, Jacob Zuma had his own witches, or what we call sangomas. You know what I mean?
You see, and it's not really about whether he did or did not, right? It really is about the perception that he has that access,
and that it's possible.
Exactly, which invokes something in you as a follower. So when they call Zuma, he used to be a chief spy for ANC, and then you start to realize he's friends with the king. The king is acknowledging him, and he derives a lot of spiritual significance and authority from that, to be acknowledged by someone who is a representative of many clans and bloodlines. And then you have this guy who is a son of their soil governing the country. It was like a power unity. And then you see him there doing what? Every time Zuma is clowned, it's about, oh, he used to dance, huh? And people laugh, but he knew that to his followers, he was drawing them back to their spiritual thing. War cries, he was singing war cries, the most spiritual form in any African culture. Is song, dance, and war cries. So when everybody gets rallied into war, and those whatever song it was, invokes something that makes people have non-negotiables. It doesn't matter what you try and say, nice to me, my culture and my bloodlines, non-negotiable. I'm going to kill you, baby. I'm going to do anything, right? You see? So people have always been surprised. How come Zuma keeps getting these people to vote him in? And it's because the people would be professional as much as they could. But then when they're in the presence of people and the people who follow him, and it's like a message that, Babwe too, and this whole vibe, like this huge cloud that would follow him, and people saying that it's spiritually ordained. And if you say spiritually ordained, and then you argue with it, and then they say, why do you think the king acknowledged it? Why do you think that section within the whole Zulu clan was acknowledging him? All those elders, and it, you see. So sometimes you'll be thinking, are they practicing witchcraft? Whether they are or they're not, but the fact is, there's a certain access
in
terms of
a spiritual aura.
When you put it like that, like
sorry guys, by the way, the Idris Elba movie is a Beast of No Nation.
Beast of No Nation. All right. I was saying, when you put it that way, right, that Zuma was engaging people on a level where they were saying like, this is spiritually ordained. It's interesting because that touches upon something that is very relevant to humankind and human psychology, like the need to associate, because the way I've always looked at it was that the church needed to affiliate itself with the monarchy in order to survive, right? In order to survive, not being the one who calls the shots, but still having some invaluable importance to the nation. But in this situation, that's, that spiritual element doesn't have some sort of institution that's being protected by Zuma's actions. Instead, it's more about what it's invoking in the people. This idea that the person leading us is meant to lead us. And it's the same thing that like was instilled with regard to almost every monarchy around the world, where it's like the person leading us is here because of God. There's an interesting aspect to human psychology when you think about that. But what I wanted to actually touch upon was what you said maybe 15 minutes ago about how in order for the Christians to really infiltrate the African culture or the African society, they had to basically dismantle the African culture. And it's like a book that I think of is Things Fall Apart, if you remember that book. Where one thing that was very interesting was that the protagonist of the story starts out very strong, stubborn in some cases, but very much giving the vibe of being unshakable. And it's interesting how, as his traditions, his cultures start to unravel around him, he starts to become shaken. He starts to become more vulnerable. And I just thought that, like, I just realized right now that that book does a great job of creating that atmosphere of, over time, you can see how the traditions themselves are being thinned out by Catholicism. And so the character himself he's no longer as firm and strong as he was. He's starting to fall apart, as the title suggests. And it's also interesting because I think of the Witcher books. The Witcher series is something that's very popular, the games, the TV show. But in the novels, one thing I always found interesting was that every so often Andrzej Sapkowski would create this atmosphere where it's like that pagan belief, that culture essentially of believing in fairies and pagan rituals and basically that kind of fantastical mindset, giants and all of that. It was all basically phased out the same way Christianity phased out African, traditions and cultures and our mythos. And it was industrialization that did this for them. The slow growing to become more industrialized, that phased them out of their old and cultural ways of thinking and believing, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, look, it also boils down to the fact that, a lot of the time we don't like to see some of these spiritual aspects as inherently tied to politics. That's why we try to separate it so much. But if you realize it, there's two things you will notice. One of those which I mentioned earlier is that at some point, some countries were being governed by the Bible, as the Bible being the constitution, and the others becoming secular, which was a constitution written by man. And basically, these were supposed to be the codes for how to live your life, in terms of morality, societal expectation getting set in that format. And a lot of people don't draw that parallel anymore because we've stopped asking the question of the church versus the state. But you will notice political leaders and